Hello everyone. Today I will be presenting about President Manuel Acuña Rojas, the post-war president of the Philippine Republic. I will issue a warning. I do not claim property of everything written or any photos. They belong to the original writers, and these are only references. Please treat with utmost secrecy. First, let us start with his biography. So we have the introduction to Rojas. Manuel Rojas was born in Capiz, Philippines, on January the 1st, 1892. He died of a heart attack in Clark Airfield, Pampanga, on April 15, 1948. He went to the University of the Philippines to study law, the profession of law. He began his political career in 1917 in the small municipality of Capiz, which was later renamed Rojas in 1949 in remembrance for his great actions to the municipality. He was elected to the Philippine House of Representatives after serving as a governor of the province of Capiz for 3 years, and those 3 years is 1919 to 1921. Manuel Rojas was a Speaker of the House and a member of the Council Senate at the time. In protest of the U.S. Governor Leonard Wood vetoing laws passed by the Philippine legislature, he and Manuel Quezon and a few members of the Philippine Senate actually withdrew from the Council of State, including President Laurel, the former president before Manuel Rojas. The Philippine Independence Mission was led by Laurel and Sergio Osmeña, the leader of the Nacionalista Party, to Washington, D.C. in 1932, where they influenced the passage of the Hair Hose Cutting Act. Later, Quezon opposed Rojas, claiming that the move jeopardized the future Philippine independence. The Nacionalista Party was split on the subject. Rojas, on the other hand, was a member of the convention that drafted the Philippine Constitution in 1934. And as what I've said in President Laurel, he was part of that. There were three presidents who actually took part in drafting the Philippine Constitution. As part of the amendment, Philippine Independence and Commonwealth Act, or the Tidings-MacDuffin Act. Rojas was also the Commonwealth Government Secretary of Finance from 1938 until 1940, for only 2 years. Now, during World War II, Rojas worked for Jose Laurel's pro-Japanese government, procuring rice for the Japanese troops, despite the fact that the court was established after the war to trial collaborators. However, General Douglas MacArthur protected Rojas, and the reason because of this, Rojas actually served as a military officer in the United States, and Rojas was elected President of the Commonwealth in 1946. Keep in mind, President Manuel Rojas was the last president of the Commonwealth Philippines and the first president of the Third Philippine Republic, as the nominee of the Nacionalista Party's liberal wing, which later became the Liberal Party. And he became the new republic's first president when the independence was declared on July the 4th, 1946. So they were very different from Laurel. He was very different from Laurel. Laurel is keen on opening relations with the Japanese after the war, while Rojas, on the other hand, was keen on opening relationship with the United States after the war. While both of them had contradictory approach to one another, it is safe to say that both of them did their best during their presidency the importance of what comes first and what comes last. Now we will talk about the significant laws. During his administration, Manuel Rojas backed two significant law, two significant bills. These regulations were important for the Philippines' post-war recovery. As we all know, he was the president post-war Philippines. The Philippine Rehabilitation Act was one, and the Philippine Trade Act were the two sta- statutes in question, or the Bell Trade Act. The US pledging 800 million US dollars in reconstruction assistance for the war-torn Philippines, was a major factor in Rojas' backing for the Bell Trade legislation. The US Congress ultimately passed the Bell Trade Act, describing the state of the Philippine economy and managing the Philippines' independence from the Americans. Government authorities were discouraged from controlling the country's import market by a system of preferential tariffs. As you can see, these two significant bills actually had its own downfall, especially the Bell Trade Act or the Philippine Trade Act. They were forcing the Philippines to only import from them, paving the way for the Americans to have a better income than the Philippines itself. The Treaty on General Relations between the Philippines and the United States was ratified on August the 5th, 1946, and on July the 4th, 1946, it declared Philippine independence and surrendered American jurisdiction over the islands. This deal also includes the creation of US bases, which we know lasted for about a few years after his death. This deal also includes the creation of US bases. The Treaty of General Relations was signed on March the 14th, 1947. Manuel Rojas granted a general amnesty to insurgents imprisoned during World War II. And on September the 7th, 1946, all individuals jailed for conspiring with the Japanese were granted general amnesty on January the 28th, 1948. Rojas was hampered by an earlier amnesty because he was afraid that the Americans would stop providing financial aid to the country. Now, during Manuel Rojas' governance, when Manuel Rojas took office as the first president of the Third Republic, the Philippines was in a post-war stage. Production dropped, education dropped, unemployment rose, American interference increased, and the Hukbalap movement grew stronger. Because of this, because of the situation, the country, his inauguration speech focused on the country's rehabilitation. The Bell Trade Act, sometimes known as the Philippine Trade Act, was signed in exchange for 800 million in restoration funds. Other policies, such as the general amnesty, the military bases agreement, were adopted alongside it. The majority of policies were managed by the American government officials in order to benefit American residents. Now keep in mind, benefit American residences. People were outraged by the issues like the Bell Trade Act, which permitted the Americans to plunder the Philippines' natural riches. As we know, Rojas was a patronizer of the American culture, and maybe he wanted us to see how maybe we can use the Americans as a tool for our later plans so that we can be protected from any type of danger. Sadly, this was ultimately removed because that right should have been reserved for the Filipino nationals. The countrymen left felt cheated. People were further enraged by the military bases agreement, which permitted the US to keep their leased bases in the Philippines until 2045. Rojas struggled to control those who disagreed with the news. People tried to kill him, but he was fortunate enough to survive. So what did Manuel Rojas left for us, or his legacy? The most significant one is that Rojas paved the Philippine independence and laid the groundwork for the Philippine independence. As you can see, he was a post-war president, and on July the 4th, he actually started to work on the Philippine independence and laid out the groundwork. And then during this time, he was still also battling the problems of the Philippines post-war. As you can see and what you have heard from me, that most of these problems took place because people still disagree with by how the Americans were bit cheating the Philippines itself. Now, we will talk about his downfall. The Philippines and the United States approved the Treaty on General Relations on August the 5th, 1946. And on July the 4th, 1946, it recognized Philippine independence and surrendered American rule over the Philippines. The deal also included the creation of U.S. bases. The Treaty of General Relations, or TGR, was signed on March 14, 1947. Manuel Rojas granted general amnesty to the guerrillas imprisoned during World War II. And on September 7, 1946, all individuals jailed for conspiring with the Japanese were granted general amnesty on January 28, 1948. Rojas was hampered by an earlier amnesty because he was afraid that the Americans would stop providing financial help to the Philippines. Any questions?